Testing. Can everyone hear me? Can everyone in the back hear me?
I do it.
Put your hand up if you can hear me. No one can hear me. Great. I guess we'll get the show on the road, shall we? Thank you for coming to the event here at the Dutch Perm Rep. I'd like to thank them myself for letting me in. Now I'm not a EU citizen anymore. Very gracious of you. This is probably going to be one of many discussions going forward about climate action, the Green Deal, industrial policy, everything that we've come to know over the last 2 or 3 months, thanks to the European Commission's new Green Deal Climate Action Commission. Hopefully it will be a revealing and informative one. That's part of my job and part of the 2 people to my left's job for the next hour and a half or so. Starting on my far left, Diederik Samsom, Cabinet Head for Frans Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, first Executive Vice President of the European Commission.
Well, we're still haggling about that. Formally, it's Executive Vice President.
Voila.
And the first replacement of the President.
In charge of everything climate action, Green Deal based.
That's the important part.
That's the important part. And then Ava Craddock, who is founder and CEO of Metabolic, a consultancy that you will tell us more of in a moment. You specialize in everything from closed water systems, smart freight schemes, textiles. You work with businesses and cities to promote a innovation in sustainable and circular economy model, if that's correct. But starting with you, Diederik, you've been a political party leader, green energy CEO, nuclear physicist by training.
And the water over my head. Yeah, basically that. It was a fun time, but it's a long time ago now, by the way. I recognize coming here in Brussels, nobody knows me, so people start Wikipediaing you, and actually that's the prominent part. They stopped after that with updating my page. So everybody thinks, that's the former Greenpeace activist. Well, in the Netherlands, actually, that's not the connotation anymore.
So what do you do now? In
well,
2 lines or so, what's your main...
At the moment?
Yeah.
Getting the Green Deal done. That's basically what we are here for. That's also the project why I took up my life and went to Brussels, which I never envisaged to do. But now I'm here anyway, and I like it, by the way, too. But this project is what we're here for.
We will end up in Brussels somehow.
Yeah.
Ava, turning to you. You founded a sustainable economy consultancy. And like I said, you specialize in so many different things. Tell us what it's like to make money from climate action.
Well, do you want me to say anything more about the company or no?
Please, tell us about it.
Okay, fine. Maybe just for all of you who probably haven't heard of Metabolic, because we're a relatively new player on the scene. We're turning 8 this year. So it's actually, Metabolic is more of an ecosystem of organizations than a single company. We have a consultancy, a think tank, and a venture building arm that work together. So building actually companies that solve some of the challenges that we're finding, or into the think tank where we do further research and create open source tooling. So we've worked with hundreds of different companies and cities to get people moving. It basically will cost exactly the same amount of capital to maintain the current energy system infrastructure versus transitioning to a renewable, decarbonized energy infrastructure. But then, in addition, there's billions of euros in addition of costs that are going to be incurred by not making that transition. So the math is really simple there. And I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of the benefits later. A lot of people still have this idea that solar panels are really expensive, for example, and the prices of solar power have been going down by 15% a year since 2009. So the price points and conditions for this have really drastically changed, and it's really possible to create very solid business cases around decarbonized approaches. So I'm sure you have a lot more to add about this.
A lot, but
yeah.
Let's...
I mean, just to recap to anyone who maybe hasn't heard what the European Green Deal is, maybe there is 1 or 2 people, it's what Ursula von der Leyen has called the growth strategy for Europe as well, man on the moon moment. It contains everything from overall targets to tweaks to transport, agri-food, R&D and everything. And we actually have a short video presentation now to illustrate
cool.
that.
This morning, the College of Commissioners agreed on the European Green Deal.
The European Parliament has voted to declare a climate emergency. we have reached an agreement on climate change.
We went right out of the gate, 11 days in the mandate with this Green Deal plan. And I think the Green Deal is different from normal environmental policy that we have seen dozens of in the last decades. I think it's different in 3 ways. And that's also why it's perceived different. And I hope it stays that way, by the way, but that's our job. The first one is obviously its ambition. For once, we didn't go for what's feasible, but what's necessary. So the climate neutral goal, the minus 55 in 2030, but also a complete stop on the loss of biodiversity, a zero pollution environment, all those goals that, well, were actually long overdue to be set by the European Union. We now set them, and we will hammer them in stone if needed, for instance, with the climate law. And the second part is obviously the comprehensiveness. For once, this wasn't an environmental policy or a climate policy or an energy policy or a transport plan or an agricultural plan, but this was one plan for everything. For an obvious reason, it's one ecosystem. We live in it, we live from it, and we should preserve it, and we should have a plan to do that. And the third one is, we might want to talk about that later, but is that we did realize that this will be a just and fair transition, otherwise it will not happen. And that's the difficult part, by the way. The transition itself, as you already sort of introduced, technology is at the moment going at a mind-boggling speed. The transition itself, well, we have to help it a little, but it will happen. The question whether it will happen in a just and a fair way, that's up to politicians and governments that have the guts and also the solidarity to do so. So this is really an urgent time.
And how does time frame and haste factor into what you do when you speak to clients, and if we can call them that? You know, are you pushing them for basically, if we don't do this now, it's a bad thing?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think we're all pushing that message. I mean, it's now the transition 20s, and a lot of people, we've been watching the kind of rise that we can afford have been lowered from 2 to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The heat is on. So it's even in our mission statement to transition the global economy to a fundamentally sustainable state as quickly as possible, and to really identify how we can get that going. So, I mean, one of the key strategies, I think, that's also emerging around that, we just had our strategy retreat a couple of weeks ago, and we realized that even if we had like unlimited capital to grow our own activities and multiply the size of our team and engage more clients and more companies and cities, we would not be able to address this transition challenge alone. It is really about deep partnership now, and really dropping some of the barriers between organizations that used to be competitors, and really figuring out, okay, so how do we take our own places, our own responsibilities in this whole effort, and combine that into a big push. And that's actually one of the things that I'm most excited about, that we're seeing all of these kinds of linkages take place.
The Green Deal is a massive piece of, let's not call it legislation, but it's a massive list of things. And you talked about it being, we're not even got 5 years left. No, it's less than 5 years. I mean, the first thing that clued me onto the non-existence of Santa Claus was, how can this white-bearded man do all of these things in 1 year? How can this white-bearded man that you work for do all of this in 4 now? Is the Commission equipped to do this? Have you set yourself too much of a target?
Maybe, but that's better than the other way around.
Yeah.
Let's find out. And I'm certain that the Commission is not big enough. Well, it's still a very big Commission, 27 commissioners, a whole Berlaymont building filled. But it's by far not enough. As you say, it's the partnership that we need to make this happen. And that's also the Green Deal. Yes, it's also a list. Sometimes you have to make a list of things that you want to do to, well, discipline yourself and the rest of the world. But it's also a big piece of ambition to work together with everybody else. And the beauty of it, we only discovered it after the 11th of December, is that there's a lot of hidden enthusiasm that all of a sudden comes out of all the bushes and all the alleys and all the parts of Europe saying, hey, this was something that I want to be part of. And that's actually our biggest challenge at the moment, to make that happen. And we invented the Brussels thing, a concept which is called the Climate Pact, but we really have to fill that with, with real people doing real things, learning from each other, inspiring each other, encouraging each other, and also comforting each other because things will go wrong and not go as fast as we wanted. And maybe that's
A list of measures and things. And there is this disconnect between...
Focus on carbon impact reduction. You can do that while at the same time creating huge biodiversity problems or water issues or toxicity problems. For example, with light bulbs, right? So we phased out the incandescent bulb in the Netherlands, and the first replacement was the, so far, begins to achieve that. And it brings in issues around the digital transition and the circular economy and all of these different pieces. So I'm really happy to see that. I do think that there are still, the devil is in the details. So how is this going to be really operationalized and really turned into specific policy? Like one of the things that we've recently finished is a study on the different materials, the rare earth metals that are needed to actually achieve the sustainability, the energy transition. And we have found that there are simply, it's not that there's not enough metal, there is, but the ability to extract it from the earth at the right...
Funny to see how, because, well, I'm relatively new, much newer than most of you here. I'm starting to find out how this Brussels machine works. And actually, there's a lot of silos that work next to each other, doing very important work without knowing what the other person is doing. And this is a good example for the energy transition, probably in Africa, and what will happen then. So there's all kinds... And the Green Deal was actually needed to put those in one room and say, okay, charging point. And we're going to invent that in the next, well, I hope in the next 3 to 4 years, might be a decade. That's the beauty of innovation, you never know. But we need to bring everybody, and actually Brussels is filled with people that do great stuff, interesting stuff, working on new policies, but also implementing those policies, funding tremendous research. But we need to bring that together in order to get this done. And the Green Deal is our best attempt so far. Let's see how it works, because we've only just started. Huh?
I mean, this all gets kicked off on the 4th of March with the climate law being released.
Yeah, but that's,
sometimes
people know what happens in politics. You get distracted. There will be a migration crisis coming up, maybe. There will be an economic slowdown or even a recession. And at that moment, we tend to drop all the things that we had in our hands and go for the next urgency. And the climate law is designed to enshrine the 2050 target in law, but also the trajectory towards it, because it's easy to have a target somewhere there in 2050, and then have a trajectory which goes like that, which is not very credible. So you need to also have the intermediate ones, the 230, 240 targets. And most important, we will oblige ourselves to assess progress and to introduce new measures if we are not on track, to get ourselves back on track. So it's actually creating some sphere for a while.
You discipline yourself, as you say. I mean, Ava, from a kind of local level, mayors, cities, this kind of, where you deal quite a lot. Is there a lot? How long does it take for that kind of policy making to sort of trickle down to that level? Is it an immediate, there's more interest now in carbon neutrality, for example, because of the 2050 target, or is there does it take some time?
No, I mean, I think cities are often even leading the pack, and that's something that has been noticed for many years. So there was this famous or well-known book in the kind of city circle called If Mayors Ruled the World, and sorry, this thing keeps falling off. So I think cities are actually often setting very ambitious targets that even go ahead of what national level policies are putting forward, depending on how progressive they are. And so there's obviously cities that are, that this is part of their brand, that they really want to have that kind of advancement as part of their strategy. And I think if you look at the total number of people in the world that are living in cities, this is also a great place to focus, because 70% of the population is estimated to be living in cities in 2050. So that's already going to be affecting most people.
That's interesting how you say some cities see it as part of their brand. I mean, is that something that Europe is now striving for? That we're green, that's our defining characteristic, or it needs to be.
We sort of go around in the world for a while already with patting ourselves on the back saying we are the greenest continent in the world. And we still are. But they are catching up. And if we want to lead the world further, we need in the rest of the world, there's not that many people that say, okay, that's interesting. A tree around the corner, just a greener city, a greener street with more visible green and more visible trees, that is what makes people much more happy. I mean, it cools the ambient temperature, it increases biodiversity, it cleans the air, it's nice to look at, it feels good. That's what people like, and we shouldn't underestimate the power of that. So part of the Green Deal will all obviously be about big things like ETS and clean steel and hydrogen production. And a large part of it will be about trees, about green cities, about clean water and clean air for you and your kids to breathe. Because we want to, as I said, we want to keep people engaged. And the worst thing to do that is to talk about the ETS.
A rather famous Swedish teenager says something along the lines of, don't listen to me, listen to the science. But there's a lot of science out there, there's a lot of data out there. What do you rely on when you're going about your business? Is it numbers that you've sort of crunched?
Movements that's going on right now in the whole environmental management field is something called science-based targets. And that's the kind of recognition or realization that we can't set environmental targets anymore based on what peer range in order for the Earth to be livable for humans. So this isn't even some grand ambition of like frolicking animals and flourishing trees. It's just making it survivable for us. And we've already crossed 4 out of 9 of the boundaries that have been defined, including climate change, though biodiversity loss and nitrogen are far worse, actually, in terms of the degree to which they've been crossed. And so the science-based targets movement is actually making the effort to say, okay, well, we know what budgets we have. We have budgets for carbon. We have budgets for nitrogen. And we actually have to stick to those budgets and have companies set their targets in line with the science. So there's this big effort to do that, and we're also helping a lot of organizations set their targets on climate and carbon in line with the budgets that we have defined, which have now been downscaled to different sectors. But there's still a lot of work to do to develop these methodologies. We're part of this network that's trying to develop methodologies for biodiversity and nitrogen and water, et cetera, and those are actually much, much more difficult than carbon. And we have to, from this integrated perspective, look at all of these things at the same time to make sure we're not doing this burden shifting. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm pretty sure it does. I mean, you're a scientist by training, Diederik, but I guess a lot of this is about coherence when it comes to the European Commission because of the size of the European Commission. Your boss said something along the lines in his European Parliament hearing that he cannot say with any confidence that the European Commission hasn't been guilty of incoherent policy making in the past. Is that something that you see as well that needs to be addressed, is being addressed?
It's one of the challenges, and I can't exclude that we're still doing it, and I even can't exclude that we will keep doing it. Please come forward. We even have a website for that you. I was used to in the better regulation time, which is still there, by the way, but that was the former job of Frans Timmermans, obviously. So we tapped into that and say, hey, better regulation is actually about this. The best regulation is regulation that brings us to a sustainable future. So let's open that website and have people report stuff that doesn't comply with what we actually promising. And I think that will be filled. Because there's a lot of rules out there that are still there from the past, and you can't just get rid of them.
Well, probably not the entire website, but so I mean, there's simple things too. Like just this morning, I was asked a question about the kind of incompatibility between really moving towards a fully circular economy and recycling everything that's already there, and also handling toxicity and dealing with hazardous waste. Because you have all these hazardous materials, also a lot of them are not even properly tracked or labeled, like additives and plastics, et cetera, that if you start putting them into a new products, they just perpetuate through the system. So we actually do need to have ways of bringing these together. One of my favorite, actually, inconsistencies, or not favorite, but one of the things that we've been trying to do is also figure out how we can process waste into high-value uses. And in cities, you really need to cities are right now these big resource drains, which are taking all these different, well, food basically and various products that end up there. And ideally, you would have a way of capturing the nutrients and putting them back into valuable uses closer to the cities. And one way of doing that with organic waste is by feeding it to insects and then using those insects as for why this exists. And there, but policy has to also evolve.
I think I still can't give blood in France because of that as well.
Wait, because you're considered livestock?
Being British, I think. I'm not
British
quite
livestock.
British,
That's the worst.
I mean, it seems pretty clear then what we want to do and when we want to do it by. But of course, we have to talk about how to pay for it, which is routinely one of the biggest gripes that member states' governments have with increased ambition and so on. I mean, some of the figures of how you could pay for it. The Commission's pledged €1 trillion under the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan.
Yeah.
Another acronym to remember for everyone.
SIPE. Nice.
The EIB, the same figure over the next decade. I mean, it seems like a good start if you can comprehend how much €1 trillion is. But how do you make sure it gets into the right hands?
Yeah.
That you don't have to hire McKinsey's in order to get some money out of them, for example.
And by the way, we struggled a lot to make that Sustainable Europe Investment Plan. And at the day that we wanted to launch it, and we actually launched it because it was planned, at the same day, BlackRock announced the money that was all of a sudden there. I think it's going fast with this sustainable finance developments. There's all kinds of institutes that now have to be refinanced every 5 years, paying new debts with old debts, things like that. But that refinancing gets more difficult for internal combustion engine factories, much more difficult, because who's going to invest in that for the next maybe 5 years? Yes, it will be there. I don't tell you a secret, but 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we will still make internal combustion engine. Volkswagen already announced that they're going to stop with it. The development is completely stopped. Money and power in the hands of less people. I mean, the best example is you changing the whole society. So we have to be aware of the effects of that. And as I said in the beginning, we are very conscious of the fact that this will be a just and fair transition. Otherwise, it will just not happen. We are a democracy, and then it will be stopped.
So maybe can I ask something a little provocative? Or I think it might be nice to have like a bit of a provocative discussion, capitalism and how it's working, and partly because of this social justice reason. The way that the current system works is that it has a kind of feedback loop within it, which is a standard systems paradigm, success to the successful, which basically translates to, if you have money, it's easy to make money and hold on to it. And the more money you have, the more money you can get. And it concentrates the wealth in these really specific pools.
Yeah.
And that is just a product of the way that system functions. So what do you think of the idea that actually we need to evolve the fundamental model of the economic system in order to get to something that produces the type of outcome that we want, like a capitalism 2.0 or something like that?
Yeah, but
that's my question gone. Thanks.
You could call the world that we in now, right now, at least in Europe, a capitalism 2.0. It's not the raw capitalism that we started off with that is gone, but maybe this isn't enough either. Somebody told me in the last month a very illustrative example. Growth has a speed, but it also has a direction. Simple, we are a finite planet, so infinite growth can't be sustainable. But then we did a little test in between 2010 and 2014. Europe didn't grow. The experiment, well, nobody liked it. I can tell you. It didn't work. Growth will be there, is always there. If one of us gets up tomorrow out of bed, you want to do a little better than yesterday. See your kids grow up more than yesterday. And that's all those people together, 500 million in Europe, getting up out of bed every morning, wanting to do a little better, that's growth. But then so that's there. And then we have to take care that the growth goes into the right direction. And that's where policy helps, not as the main factor, but it helps.
Sure. I mean, I think we all have this inherent desire to improve our lot and to do better and better. But that also has to do with what is growing, not just the direction, right? So, I mean, there's been a long campaign against GDP as the measure of growth, and moving to a more holistic measure of well-being. Or, for example, everyone often talks about how, or many people talk about how we're growing capital at the expense of natural capital. And so if you measure those things together, then you have a different measure of growth. And lastly, you can grow complexity and like IP and value while not actually changing the total mass of the economy. So this is like fundamentally the kind of decoupling argument as well. So with the same amount of material that's in this table, you can have this table, or you can have lots of different
I agree.
polymers that are... Yeah,
no, I agree. There's loads of, and GDP is obviously a stupid way of measuring growth. I mean, if I would ask the whole audience here to start passing on your wallet to the person next to you, and we keep doing that until you have your wallet back, the GDP has grown. Because there's loads of activities that have happened with transfer parameters, benchmarks for growth. That's not that's a challenge. But the real challenge is obviously to convince everybody that growth needs to have a direction. And if we grow in the wrong direction, you should stop, walk back, and go into the other one. And that's difficult. That's difficult because you were growing, you were happy. Loads of companies experience that at the moment. They are growing, but they feel they might be at a point where they have to stop, go back, and go into the other direction. And that's painful.
I mean, we can talk about costs and growth until the cows come home. But there's one cost, this cost of inaction, that seems to be missing quite often from the climate debate in a way. And it's probably quite fitting that we're in the Dutch perm rep, because it's arguably is the pessimistic side of it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Well, it's funny that you asked, because that on action, that wasn't there. That wasn't there. That had to be somewhere dug out of an attic somewhere, and that was a very old figure. That was actually wrong. So no, we don't have the real estimate, and it would be very helpful if we can. It will always be a modeling exercise, which is very difficult, because it's the future that hasn't happened yet. And actually for the Netherlands, you might think like that we are the ones having the most to lose, so we should run around in panic and start doing something. But actually, if you tell her on the costs of inaction, or the cost of doing nothing, or, because that's the other way, the loss of opportunity, if you don't invest in this new technology, in this new future, in those new cars, in those new insulated homes. Because you also said it's a lot of cost, and you mentioned the trillion.
Interesting recent studies that have been examining the cost of inaction, and I cited one of them just at the beginning, saying that, okay, the base scenario of the cost of capital for the current energy system versus the new one is the same, but there are huge costs of inaction associated with sticking with the current one, and that is actually several times more than the investment cost that's needed now. So 3 to 7 trillion. And of course, these are estimates from these types of studies that have to be verified, and they're on a global level, so they're not, on a European level. But there's more and more research that's coming out on this scale, and it has to do with health effects like air pollution, which is currently causing millions and millions of premature deaths a year, all sorts of weather-related events, and I mean, there's dozens of different sorts of costs, including the loss of natural capital, like the loss of potentially 1 million out of the estimated 8 million known species on the planet. And how do you value that? Like, what is the value of the existence of tigers? But I think also what you said before, that different groups are already starting to take action very quickly, because it's kind of like a feedback loop. So we're working with several banks and private equity organizations that now refuse to invest or maintain shares in organizations like dairy companies, because they're already seeing that as a high-risk portfolio piece. Yeah. And so I think that these types of feedback loops, as different choices start getting made and they start trickling down and affecting the movement of capital, it's going to really accelerate the change in a rapid way. And it's going to change the logic of how people are making investments.
I mean, we've touched on the social aspect of this quite heavily already, and we have a second video presentation on this very subject, if we could roll that now.
Want to have from the politicians and from the national government a clear sign
that this industry is a key industry and that the politician will protect this industry and will not have any uncertainty and uncertain possible financial burden which nobody can shoulder anymore.
So I guess the main thing for the Commission that tackles this social aspect is the Just Transition Fund, Just Transition Mechanism.
Yeah.
Is there a danger for this debate becoming something along the lines of an energy transition or a Polish coal transition? I mean, I like to use the same anecdote that your boss does. I'm the grandson of a steel worker, for example, not a coal miner. Do you think that argument has been made clear enough yet, that this isn't just about subsidizing getting rid of coal, this is about subsidizing everything?
Well, subsidizing everything will be a bit expensive, but
BlackRock.
No, BlackRock, call them. No, but you're right. We run the risk of creating the just transition into a sort of iconic thing of coal regions fighting to, well, survive or transition into something else, and there's much more around it. But it is true that there are particular challenges in particular regions, and if you have the commitment to leave no one behind, that goes for all regions in Europe. So we need to take care of that. And it needs to be a success because via those maybe iconic examples, we can show the rest of Europe that it can be done. Sometimes with some help, sometimes loads of people. Because the good part of this story is that we're talking about Poland as if nothing's happening and we are going to go there with a Just Transition Fund and then all of a sudden the transition might... No. A lot of things are happening already there. If you ask the miners there what their kids should be, nobody answers a miner. They know that they are the last generation of miners, and they're proud miners, by the way. So there's a lot of reasons to take care of that. When I was a party leader for the Social Democrats, I talked to my colleague in North Rhine-Westphalia, 30,000 jobs in lignite mining. And I was talking to him about lignite mining and, well, the need to get out of that. And he said, Diederik, there's 30,000 families dependent on lignite mining. That's 30,000 very good reasons to keep doing that for a while. And I couldn't blame him for being a responsible politician, taking care of his people. And that's also what we need to do with the whole of Europe, part of their business, and then the transfer goes much easier. And sometimes, yes, there's help needed. There's a Just Transition Fund. If you look at the size of it, it's obviously a drop in the ocean of the complete necessity of finance. But what we hope is that you can sort of create the first spark, and then the fire might spread itself. But that's going to be a challenge. We now frantically working on getting together with regions on so-called territorial just transition plans, another acronym that you will hear a lot about, because we need to get this right, and that's difficult, because we're finding out while doing it.
I mean, it seems like the coal miner will go the same way as the stagecoach builder or the horseshoer in terms of a large industry. I mean, if you ever have to, when you advise people on how to, implement a strategy, a circular economy strategy, is there ever a case where you have to say you have to stop doing this, a certain thing, rather than adapt something? There's the end of the road rather than the turn around the corner.
I mean, it's all about framing. So indeed, there are definitely certain activities or certain things that should just be stopped. But you can always talk about, instead of coal mining, construction, and really evolving your business model or moving to think about that in a more proactive way, future-proofing your business model, et cetera. I think, just to speak a little bit about the coal mining situation, the statistics are that there are around 9 million coal miners in the world today, and that there will be around 15 million jobs around solar PV installation alone, and maintenance, et cetera. So there's actually much more work to compensate for that job in the kind of green economy. But it's just actually making that step, build square with the kind of world that we want to see ultimately. And what we're always trying to encourage them to do is to self-disrupt, is to think about, okay, well, what's going to happen in the market, and are you ahead of that? And is that, you don't want to be the company with the potato, the hot potato at the...
Good example. Is we gonna clean the diesel car? Well, we all know what happened with that. So if you make the wrong choice, and they did at that time, you can create a lot of damage. The good part of this story is that it's never your last choice. You can also make up for that. And that's what Volkswagen is doing right now, putting 23 electrical models on the market next year. You could call it panic, but it's at least doing something. And they're going to meet, well, I can't say for definite because the year is not even started, but we have to have in 2021 the 95 gram, the famous 95 gram per kilometer on average over your fleet. And Volkswagen was way off there only a year ago. They might going to meet it. Things can change fast. You can make up for your mistakes very fast, and that's what the car industry has to do. And then also there's an honest part of this story. Making an electrical car requires less labor than making an internal combustion engine-driven car. I mean, the amount of parts that you have to connect together is about 1/10 in an electrical car. It's basically a driving iPhone. So you can program an app or so it's not for nothing that they all of a sudden feel an enormous anger over what is changing around them. And for coal miners, it's the same thing. I mean, they powered Europe. Yeah. Something to be proud of. This building, beautiful, is built with energy powered by coal. And nuclear, by the way, because we are in Belgium. But and they are proud of that. And we profited from it, all of us. So none of us is able to say, oh, you were doing completely the wrong thing. No, you were doing the right thing, but times have changed. Mm-hmm. And only when we get that story right and we deliver on it, because the story is one thing, but delivering money and opportunities is something else, only then can we make this transition happen.
Yeah. A lot of things that you just said really resonate, because I think that one of the biggest issues that I have with some of the kind of very justifiable anger that's felt by a lot of these movements now that are going on is that they be honest and say, okay, well, we went down this path. It's not the right path. We need to figure out together how to make sure that we get through this. And I also think that there is a lot of need to learn from the lessons of the past and build more resiliency into our system. Yeah. Actually, and I really think that has to go back to education, because we have a lot of these kinds of things might happen again. We might decide that a technology of continuous learning, or these are ways to build resilience that I think we should be looking at more.
We talked about a few trillion euros over the course of a decade, fuel subsidies, for example, even though OECD countries said no more. Yeah. And this as well, I mean, there's a review going to happen. Can you ask people to make changes or have changes forced upon them when this, completely out of their control to an extent, is happening?
Well, it's like the comparison with aviation. There's a lot of people saying, justifiably, that I'm not going to switch off my gas-fired boiler as long as those planes are passing over burning kerosene like it's nothing. And it's true, it's the same here. You all have to do your part. I feel a little for the ECB because they have a pretty specific job which is called price stability and nothing else, and they were just doing that. And it's as if you tell a coal miner that he did the wrong thing. This is an institution, so it's much easier. You don't insult anybody, but we have to change that policy too. We might even rethink the objective of the ECB. I don't think it's wise to do that right now, by the way, but in the end, or maybe even sooner than later, also that money will flow somewhere else, simply because maintaining price stability is not possible when you put your money into stuff that is not worth anything in a short while. And they will find out too. They're bankers, pretty good ones, I'm told. So they should find out pretty soon.
And Ava, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that was a good answer, and I think you know a lot more about this particular thing than I do. But one thing that I did want to add is that I think that there's a huge shift happening in the whole banking sector where more and more bankers are turning to more advanced risk modeling to really understand the longer term consequences of some of these investments and action and choices. And that's something that we are also actively working on, because right now a lot of the models that are being used to predict the value of assets in the future or certain types of risks are very linear and very simple, and they're not based on the complex system dynamics that we see in the environment and in natural systems. So there has to be a better coupling of those two things, so that also we can make better financial choices around non-linear dynamics. So something that looks like it's linear but suddenly spikes or collapses, or so there's all these things that have to be taken into account.
I haven't exhausted all the questions I want to ask both of you, but I also don't want to be selfish. So if there's anyone that has any questions, we could take a few at the same time. There's a microphone somewhere.
There's a question.
Okay, the gentleman by there. And then we'll take two more and then...
Thank you very much. My name is Adro. I work for the Commission's Joint Research Center. So if you're looking for a group of scientists that is willing to help you, we're very eager to do that. We have hundreds of scientists working on climate change, soils, agriculture, forestry,
3,000
biodiversity.
actually, I was told this morning.
If you count everybody.
Okay.
Yeah,
I do.
True. That's true. That's true. You touched upon agriculture a little bit. I'm a water scientist. What I'm seeing in my projections for Europe, and what you already see now, is an enormous groundwater depletion in the Mediterranean area.
Yeah.
And that's only...
Well, the cap, that one in that motion of 15 pages, is the question asked to the Commission. Can you address, or can you assess the question whether the cap is actually in line with the Green Deal objectives? Smart question. So we now assessing the answer. You can have a very short one, but also a longer one, and we're going for the longer one because we don't want to say yes or probably no. Highlight the ground cynical way, speed up our work, because people do feel the challenge. Farmers that were probably not too susceptible to a proposal to change the whole way of farming, because again, also a farmer is proud of what he's doing because his father was doing it the same way and his grandfather too, and proud of owning the land and harvesting it. Now all of a sudden those farmers, especially in Southern Europe, are...
Agricultural system as a whole, we've been really trying to work actually mainly in the food system to try to look at regional budgets for water extraction, for nutrient emissions, et cetera, and carbon. And in particular, we actually did a study with Alpro, in a subsidiary now of Danone, looking at their Mediterranean almond farms in Spain to really understand per farm what the kind of targets could be. And I think that this kind of differential, really context-specific target setting will be essential to really understand which farms need to take certain actions, which ones need to actually intensify and produce more food, whereas some may actually need to introduce more biodiversity measures or water conservation measures. And you have to look at this at various scales. But the food system as a whole is just a huge focal area, because we know that by the FAO's projections, by 2050, we're going to have to more than double food output. And we're already using 50% of the plant habitable surface of the planet to produce food. And so this doesn't square. We're not going to be able to double food output in the same way that we're producing it now. That would mean using every single piece of the planet's surface that can support plant life to produce our food. So we actually have to innovate in a radical way that both decarbonizes, reduces pressure on water systems, improves livelihoods, and continues to provide nutritious food to everyone.
Okay, there was another question over there. There's a microphone. I think, great. If you could say who you are and where you're from.
Thank you very much. My name is Twan Manders. I'm one of the people in the European Parliament
adopting
to
that
support
motion.
this motion.
Thanks.
Life, it's all about communications, I think. I agree with all that you said, but life is about communications. Acceptance has to do with communications. Politicians are always talking about costs, and entrepreneurs are talking about earnings. Is it an idea to ask the CEO of BlackRock to give a presentation in the EU that the investments are necessary to make money out of it, instead of that it is that is costing the taxpayer a lot of money. That's one. And may I invite you to one of the startups companies who are producing formic acid to drive a car on. And that's it's a startup of two young entrepreneurs, students still. And I would be happy to invite
to us. And that's also why I get the hunch or the information from that actually things want to change quite fast over there. They see the opportunity somewhere else than the place that they are in right now, which is a good...
My name is Elizabeth Alteköster. I'm a former civil servant of the Council, Secretariat of the Council of the European Union. I would like to come back to the slide that you presented about the German car industry. As far as I can recall, the diagram showed that they will reach up to 300,000, 400,000 unemployed people at a certain stage, and that only with regard to Germany, and then we still have the French automotive industry, we still have the Italians one. So the Just Transition Fund says that it will not leave anybody behind. So how will you help, in this case, Germany, and then also the other, in this kind of transition? Does that mean that Germany will get money out of the cohesion fund or the social fund in order to buffer this? And maybe a second question, how are you intending to implement the new Green Deal into member states? Is it via the European semester reporting system? How will you control them? Do you ask them to report, then you control, then you maybe punish them? But this is a very lengthy, very complicated process. Thank you.
Does Volkswagen deserve Just Transition money?
Well, if you've seen the list of recipients of the Just Transition Fund, actually Germany is place number 2, which might raise a few eyebrows because it's not a poor country that needs external help to finance itself. It writes the so-called fired power stations, etc., quite numerous and quite challenging. So they got 700 million out of that money. The first place was obviously Poland, 2 billion. That was also the maximum that you can get. But Germany is quite high. So no cohesion fund. You know better than I how that works. I start to learn all this stuff. And one of the things that I learned is that we already have some pretty good machinery in place to get member states comply with what they themselves promised. For instance, we have that semester, so the reporting every year on whether you are on track, and on track just meant budget and deficit a while ago, and now it will mean much more than that. Much more factors are coming into that country report and the recommendations that we make around it. That's only one way. The other way, which is much more important, but now I'm going into Brussels speak, way too technical, but you have the national energy and climate plans every 5 years, or every year, but every 5 years it does count. Do you have to deliver as a member state your figures on where you are with renewable energy, energy efficiency, and now we add climate change to that too, carbon emissions. So yes, we have ways to check on member states, and we have also instruments to apply new measures if we are off track. That's all not a guarantee that things will happen. You know better than I do that we have a history of missing targets and not complying with our own legislation, but this time it's for real. So we think that this time we might be better than last time, but I'm sure my predecessor said the same. So judge me on that in 5 years' time.
Another question by there?
Hi, Mehreen from... Yeah. A political question, I think. The Commission is proposing an industrial revolution, an economic revolution, a reorientation. And on this point of legitimacy, do you win this legitimacy?
You think that was a political question, eh? Well, first of all, it's not a revolution as a social democrat. I hate that word. I'm of the since you ask people back, where did you vote exactly for? I mean, generation. It was 1 or 2 in all countries, even Eastern European. That doesn't give you legitimacy by default, no. But the whole Green Deal is obviously into the European machinery. Part of that is the Council. The Council is occupied with governments that are having a democracy, has its own ways of joining or not joining. If that happens, we will see it happening. So, yes, I'm not worried about it, but I'm conscious of the fact that every day again we have to earn this license to operate. We have to agree with me, but I think we changed it for the better.
A great question, because one of the things that we fear too is this sort of like Yellowjacket backlash that happened when Macron introduced the fuel tax, and then all of a sudden you have people legitimately angry on the street for various reasons. And I think we need to figure out, and I mean, I'm looking to you and all of your team to figure out how to align the kind of benefits and incentive structures with some of these changes so that people legitimately feel like they are benefiting from the transition and really making it these types of mechanisms or these types of policies that...
Well, yes, it's one of the main jobs which we target, and nobody is surprised if I say that hasn't happened yet, not by any means, including the EU, because our ambition dropped down somewhere in a desk in Paris is 40%, minus 40% in 2030. And we know that will not bring us towards the objective of keeping the world within a 1.5 degree limit. So we have to step up to the plate and increase our ambition, and we aim to, and we hope that that will inspire others to join, and maybe a US election might help too.
At what point does the European Commission or European Union have to get nasty, in a way? You mentioned the NECPs. Got the member states, some will not do enough to meet certain targets. At what point do you start using the carrot, the stick instead of the carrot? And the same in the international scene, where you have things like carbon border tax as a defense mechanism, for example. When do you start saying, right, we're the good guys here, this is what, traditional diplomacy hasn't worked.
Yeah,
do you hope it doesn't get to that point?
We're not going out there in the presumption that it will not work. So we go out there in the presumption that it works and that everybody joins on this journey and that we can live in peace all together. But mentalities that we have when we go out there in the world, to China, to India, to South Africa, to the US, yes, to Brazil, and we say, okay, we want to raise the ambition, do you join? And we think the answer might be yes, because a lot of countries have something to gain there. Not in the last place China itself, with its new technology and the way it operates. But if not, we're not going to shy away from measures that will take care of our interests. We are a continent with a geopolitical interest.
I mean, it's always an empty but nice question to end on, but optimistic. There's the climate law in March, there's COP at the end of the year, normally disappointing, sometimes it isn't. Are you personally, as people, like human beings, you're a human being that works at the European
level, I wouldn't be doing what I do, which is getting up every morning and fighting for these types of change and the lack of technology or the lack of capital. And so I think we're going to have to see whether we can achieve this kind of broader mindset shift and consciousness shift, which a lot of different institutes have identified as like the fundamental prerequisite for achieving the broader transition. So I think all of us individually can do our part in trying to spark that mindset shift and seeing whether we get far enough, fast enough to get the kind of ball rolling. And even if I am not a total 100% optimist, I think we're going to make some progress, and progress is better than nothing at all. And we'll see how we manage the future. And I think there's a really great potential outcome if we all put our minds together and our hearts together to get it going.
Diederik, can your boss get it done?
Yeah, together with everybody else. And I can say I'm very optimistic, for loads of reasons. For instance, the dedication that I see here in Brussels and the intelligence of the people working here in Brussels makes me optimistic. But maybe I'm most optimistic because of a thing that I found out in the last weeks, talking to loads of people, including CEOs and others. And almost in every conversation, there is that moment that a very important man or a bad piece in the newspaper, which are convincing things for politicians or CEOs. But conversation, those kids going home asking their fathers and mothers impertinent or pretty pertinent questions about the future and the contribution they might give to that future, that is, I experienced it myself, that is quite convincing. You don't want to sit in front of your kids and have nothing to say. So I think that is one of the drivers, and if it stays that way for a while, then we might be in a better place. Yeah.
A nice note to end on. I mean, the Brits are out, but our punctuality remains. Look at that. There will be cocktails and everything, so fill your boots over there. What remains for me to do is thank Ava, thank you, Diederik, for your time, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you.